This is Trevor Lawrence, and he's supposed to be the next generational QB to enter the NFL, to save the Jaguars from franchise purgatory. But he has failed to live up to those expectations, right? Well, maybe. But before we decide whether he's failed or succeeded, we have to examine how he's compared to other generational QBs to begin with. Let's break it down. There has been 4 true consensus generational QB prospects to enter the NFL. And now you know Trevor Lawrence is one of them, but who was the first? Well, we have to look all the way back to the year 1983. LA was the first so-called generational QB prospect, but his start to his career did not live up to the hype that he was supposed to be. And in his first year, he was benched for Steve DeBerg, though it is critical to point out that he was only started because DeBerg was injured at the start of the season. Nonetheless, LA would become the star of the following season and keep the reins there onward. But it wasn't until 4 years later that LA would live up to the generational status that he was supposed to be. This moment or shift occurred during the AFC Championship against the Browns, when LA would leave a 98-yard comeback drive to tie the game and go into overtime, which he then would lead a 6-yard drive to set up a field goal to win the game. The point is that it took LA quite a few years to reach that generational level that he was supposed to be. And for Trevor Lawrence, we are entering year 4 for him. And while there is something holding Lawrence back from going all out in the field, preventing him from reaching that generational status, we'll have to get to that later. For now, if you compare Trevor Lawrence's career to LA so far, we see a pretty similar path. Lawrence had a rocky season 1, albeit with a horrendous head coach, but his performance was just as bad as LA's first year. And in the following years, both these guys had really good seasons, just not elite. And this is given the eras they were both in. Elway had those flashes, but it wasn't consistent enough to crown him in that tier of elite QBs until that AFC Championship. Likewise, Trevor had plenty of flashes as well. And what comes to mind was the game against the Ravens in Week 12 during the 2022 season. This was Trevor Lawrence's year 2, where he had some rough moments, but he led a legendary comeback in the 4th quarter to beat the Ravens, who is a AFC powerhouse then and still is now. This game was the start of what really felt like a turning point for Lawrence, for him to take the step from a long stretch of games of elite play into a cemented expectation of him. But it turned out for the 2023 season, he just didn't take that last step into the generational guy he was deemed to be. That last step to be in that tier with Mahomes, Allen, Burrow, and Rodgers. You could say he was fool's gold. Perhaps Lawrence will have that moment this 2024 season like Elway did in year 4 of his career, but that's only one generational QB to compare with. What about the most famous of all the generational QBs, Peyton Manning, aka the Sheriff? Manning was drafted during the 1998 draft, #1 overall by the Indianapolis Colts. Manning was the true generational QB of them all. He was the one guy that everyone knew he would be one of the best to play, even during his first year playing in the NFL, which was kind of brutal, breaking the interception record and looking far from what a generational QB should be on paper though. But that wasn't what the NFL thought. Analysts, announcers, players, and even fans knew that this was Manning adjusting to the NFL speed of the game, that Manning was testing the water, seeing what works and what doesn't. Well, what sets Manning apart is how he, just in a general sense, took his play all the way to the next level in only year 2, where Manning took the Indianapolis Colts all the way to the divisional round, losing to the almost Super Bowl winners in the Titans. So in year 2, Manning looked like one of the best already, with his elite play game in and game out consistently, not just flashes, and he continued to do so for the remainder of his career, while Lawrence has yet to take that leap into turning those elite plays from flashes to consistency. So compared to Manning, it ain't looking too great for the Golden Boy. But if you compare Lawrence to Elway, they are seemingly on a similar track, which requires Lawrence to take that leap this year in theory. But wait, let's go back to what I just said, where Manning took the Indianapolis Colts all the way to the divisional round, losing to the almost Super Bowl winners in the Titans. Trevor Lawrence did the same thing in year 2. He took the Jags all the way to the divisional round as well, losing by 1 score against the Chiefs, who would later win the Super Bowl. It wasn't an incredible defense or running game that led the Jaguars to the divisional round. It truly was Lawrence. But hold that thought, because there's one last generational QB to look at. With it being 1-to-1 on comparison to the other generational guys in terms of meeting generational expectations, the last QB we will look at will either make or break the case to whether Lawrence has been a generational failure or a success. The final generational QB we will look at is Andrew Luck. Luck, in an ironic way, was drafted #1 overall by the Indianapolis Colts during the 2012 draft. This was after the Colts parted ways from Peyton Manning following his neck injury. Now, Andrew Luck is pretty tricky to dissect. He was such a talented player with so many insane cerebral moments, but also with some terrible plays. The best way to put it is he would start the wildfire by those bad decisions, but then be the fireman, the hero to save the day by putting out the fires. It's the best way to describe Luck, which kind of makes it difficult to compare him to Lawrence. What we can do though is look at when his generational moment was, which, like Peyton Manning, was during his rookie year. The game that comes to mind was very sentimental. The head coach at the time, Chuck Pagano, had gotten diagnosed with cancer about a week before this game, and he announced to the team that he was going to be on leave indefinitely. In return, the Colts were determined to honor Pagano by playing their best, some wearing orange gloves to honor him, and others playing their hearts out, which means the pressure was on Luck to perform. The game was not going well for Luck though, and the Colts by the second half were down 21-3. Things were not looking good, but you know where this is going. In only one quarter, Luck would drive the Colts down the field, scoring 2 touchdowns and 1 field goal. And while the Packers responded by a touchdown, Luck would respond back, hitting Reggie Wayne for the touchdown with 35 seconds left to win the game. Now, with emotions running high and the season off to a terrible start, and a team that was just expected to be awful, Luck came through, and from there on, people saw him fulfill that generational expectation and just saw him in that light. Except his PFF grades and NFL passer rating didn't reflect generational level of play. By now, you know that passing yards and touchdown to interception ratios are not truly reflective of how good a QB is. His first 3 years in the NFL are fairly similar to Trevor Lawrence's in PFF grading, and again, NFL passer rating. But the separation was that Luck could demonstrate elite play more game in and game out, while Lawrence would have these flashes of that level of play. So it leaves us with 2 of the generational QBs living up to those generational expectations sooner than Lawrence has. And Lawrence is seemingly on a similar pace of how LA was, but we also know that it was a completely different era of football then. Because in this era, it is easier to pass the ball, with all the rule changes compared back to John Elway's and even Peyton Manning's time. So that means Trevor Lawrence is a failure, right? Well, I guess yes, in terms of what Elway, Manning, and Luck have done in their respective careers and how they in time reached that generational level of play, while Lawrence has not even reached that consistent level of elite play, he is a generational failure by comparison. I don't know about you, but that takeaway just does not sit well with me. We looked at Elway, Manning, and Luck's generational moments. We have seen what the first few years have looked like. And if we are being honest, all 3 of these QBs' trajectories all align with Trevor Lawrence's. Whether we look at stats, PFF grades, or simply win and loss records, they all look very similar as well. So why is there a disconnection then to the idea that Trevor Lawrence is actually on the same path and has lived up to the generational expectation if that's what the stats, PFF grades, and win-loss records show? Well, it's because we have been looking at this from the wrong angle. You see, we all have this bias of knowing what these generational QBs have accomplished already. If I think of John Elway, my thoughts immediately go to the last few years in Denver at the end of his career, going to the Super Bowl many times, whether it's losing or winning. Or with Peyton Manning, it's the last few years with Denver that were ecstatic and career reviving, honestly, for him winning that final Super Bowl. And with Andrew Luck too, the last few years he played were truly at that generational level. The hype around him was out of this world before he decided to retire. The problem is, we are not looking at Trevor Lawrence's final few years of his career or simply at the end of his career. It's not even possible yet. What we have to do is focus on Elway's, Manning's, and Luck's first few years, which we have already done in the video. But we just need to look at it when deciding whether Lawrence is a failure or he has succeeded in only that window of time, ignoring what we last saw from the other generational QBs and examining it from that perception of their first few years solely. And in that case, things look drastically different, but there's more to the story. Earlier, I had said something was holding Lawrence back from going all out. You see, I think things would be drastically different as well if Lawrence had a true number 1 wide receiver. Part of Lawrence's success in Clemson was having T. Higgins, who is a number 1 wide receiver, Justin Ross, and Amari Rodgers. Each of these guys provide a different skill set, and most importantly, being able to do what Lawrence is great at, which is those high leverage, difficult but big time throws. That is Trevor Lawrence's bread and butter. You see, Lawrence has not had that up until this point in his career, and honestly, he still doesn't have that yet. I don't see Brian Thomas Jr. as that guy. He could be, but I don't think he will. So where does that leave us? I think with the perception of the first few years of Manning, Elway, and Luck, I feel Trevor Lawrence has lived up to where those guys were at in the timeline of his career. I don't feel like he's lived up to the generational expectations, but I don't honestly feel Manning or any of those guys did until much later in their respective careers. But what about a guy who's trying to finish off his career like Peyton Manning did, like John Elway did? A guy who may not have been a generational QB when drafted, but will end up as one of the most talented QBs to ever play the game. The Rodgers Revenge Tour is here.